Adolf Hitler, Ayatollah Khomeini, Barack Obama. What do these men have in common? Well, besides being responsible for the deaths of hundreds of children, all three have been accused of being the Antichrist. I don't think I have to introduce the concept of the Antichrist to you guys, or the man of lawlessness, or the beast if we really want to get biblically accurate, but many people have been accused of being one since Christianity emerged from Second Temple Judaism. So, which one of these Antichrists is the closest to being one? Who's the beast to rule them all? The most lawless man to ever, lawless. In this series, or maybe episode, I'll decide to make a part 2 based on how well this video does, I'm going to be ranking alleged men of lawlessness to find out who's the closest to being the Antichrist. First up, we have Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the diabolical king of the Seleucid Empire during the Maccabean Revolt. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was born as Mithridates somewhere around 215 BC, as the son of Antiochus the Great. Yeah, I know it's hard for him to be an Antichrist candidate when he was born before Jesus was, but just go with it for now and I'll explain later. To provide some background information, around 100 years prior, some guy named something along the lines of Alexander decided to invade the Persian Empire. Maybe you've heard of him. Why did he do this? I don't know, read the 3 billion books written about him. Point is, Alexander now ruled one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen up until then. The only thing he needed to do was to live long enough to consolidate... Oh. Famously, when he was on his deathbed, he gathered up all of his generals into one room. When they asked him who the throne would go to, he allegedly replied, "To the strongest." Thus, as soon as he died, his most powerful generals immediately carved up his empire like the Thanksgiving turkey. I know, a few days earlier for you Americans. And took some kingdoms for themselves. One of my sources that I am using for this video is the first book of Maccabees. For my Protestant, Christian, and Jewish viewers, the Bible has these books that you guys consider non-canon, but Catholics and Orthodox consider canon. The 2 books of Maccabees are a few of them. I just want to mention that because it has this to say about the division. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. And you guys know that based on the last line, their descendants are about to get up to some absolutely devious shit. Anyway, back to Mithridates. Mithridates was set to inherit the Seleucid Empire, which includes modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, portions of Afghanistan, some areas of Turkey, then known as Asia Minor, and at different parts of its history, the southern Levant. More on this area later. However, because he was a potential successor, he got sent to Rome to be a hostage to ensure that the Seleucids wouldn't pull any shit with Rome. This is a pretty common system in history, the Chinese did it too. Now, while this is going on, his father, Antiochus the Great, was beefing with Ptolemy IV Philopator, who was the pharaoh of Egypt and a descendant of another guy who carved out Alexander's empire. Personally speaking, I think the conversation went a little bit like this.
Hey, Ptolemy, what's good?
Bro, don't come to me asking what's good like that. I am literally a god. Show some respect.
The fuck did I do to you?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe you keep creeping up on my territory.
Yeah, well, you're a shit god king. Who drops a bajillion coins on a ship? Literally any other king would be better at your job than you.
That's cause you're a goddamn sellout, bro. Megas Basilios, you mean great king? You are literally turning into a Persian. You're a race mixer, Antiochus. Those Greek genes are disappearing from your bloodstream.
Sure, call me a sellout. I just care about maintaining my massive empire. What excuse do you have for being so ugly, bro? Babyface? Fat-ass motherfucker. You look like your parents were brother and sister. Oh wait, your parents are brother and sister.
Bae, what's going on?
Nothing much,
Arsenoi? You're fucking your sister? Is family dinner where you look for dates? Your child is gonna have room temperature IQ in Celsius. Yeah, fuck you, I'm invading.
So, Antiochus III invaded Egypt and beat Ptolemy's ass, taking with him Judea where the Jews lived. We'll focus more on them when Mithridates becomes king, but for now, I'll just mention that Antiochus the Great had a pretty good relationship with the Jewish people. In a letter to Ptolemy IV that I took from Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Antiochus writes that, quote, "The Jews, upon our first entrance on their country, demonstrated their friendship towards us, and when we came to their city received us in a splendid manner, and came to meet us with their senate, and gave abundance of provisions to our soldiers, and to the elephants, and joined with us in ejecting the garrison of the Egyptians that were in the citadel. We have thought fit to reward them, and to retrieve the condition of their city, which hath been greatly depopulated by such accidents as have befallen its inhabitants, and to bring those that have been scattered abroad back to the city. And, in the first place, we have determined, on account of their piety towards God, to bestow on them as a pension for their sacrifices of animals that are fit for sacrifice, for wine and oil and frankincense, the value of 20,000 pieces of silver, and sacred artebrae of fine flour, with 1,460 medimni of wheat, and 375 medimni of salt. And these payments I would have fully paid them, as I have sent orders to you." Unquote. Wow, Antiochus III, you really like run-on sentences. Flavius Josephus, writing over 200 years later, says that these testimonials which I have produced are sufficient to declare the friendship that Antiochus the Great bare to the Jews. He made up with Ptolemy after this and even gave back the territory he took. Mithridates, however, would infamously take a different approach to dealing with Jewish people. Eventually, Antiochus the Great died, and his eldest son, Seleucus IV Philopator, took power. I'm going to be honest here, the sources I'm using don't really talk about him too much, so all you really need to know is that Mithridates was brought back from Rome, and Seleucus IV spent his time rebuilding, giving his brother's wife, who was also his sister, children, and dying after a couple years on the throne. It's at this time that Mithridates finally took the throne under the name Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Also, his infant nephew, also named Antiochus, co-ruled with him until he died around the age of 10. Now, I'm not trying to imply anything when I say this, but this wouldn't be the first time in history where an uncle and a nephew ended up co-ruling only for the nephew to suddenly die under mysterious circumstances. I'll let you be the judge of what happened to him. First off, Antiochus IV started off his reign by marrying his brother's widow, who was also his sister. Not only does this invalidate my earlier Antiochus III versus Ptolemy IV skit, but it's also kind of disgusting. Now, Antiochus proceeded to acquire a bit of a reputation for himself amongst his citizens. I think I'll let an excerpt of Book 26 of Polybius' Histories explain this one. He would often be seen wandering about in all parts of the city with one or two companions. He was chiefly found at the silversmiths' and goldsmiths' workshops, holding forth at length and discussing technical matters with the molders and other craftsmen. He used also to condescend to converse with any common people he met, and used to drink in the company of the meanest foreign visitors to Antioch. Whenever he heard that any of the young men were at an entertainment, he would come in quite unceremoniously, with a fife and a procession of musicians, so that most of the guests got up and left in astonishment. He would frequently put off his royal robes, and, assuming a white toga, go round the marketplace like a candidate, and, taking some by the hand and embracing others, would beg them to give him their vote, sometimes for the office of aedile and sometimes for that of tribune. Upon being elected, he would sit upon the ivory curule chair, as the Roman custom is, listening to the lawsuits tried there, and pronouncing judgment with great pains and display of interest. In consequence, all respectable men were entirely puzzled about him, some looking upon him as a plain simple man, and others as a madman. His conduct, too, was very similar as regards the presents he made. To some people he used to give gazelles' knuckle bones, to others dates, and to others money. Occasionally he used to address people he had never seen before when he met them, and make them the most unexpected kind of presents. But in the sacrifices he furnished to cities, and in the honors he paid to the gods, he far surpassed all his predecessors, as we can tell from the temple of Olympian Zeus at Athens, and the statues round the altar at Delos. He also used to bathe in the public baths, when they were full of common people, having jars of the most precious ointments brought in for him, and on one occasion, when someone said to him, "How lucky you are, you kings, to use such scents and smell so sweet," he answered nothing at the time, but next day, when the man was having his bath, he came in after him, and had a huge jar of most precious ointment called stacte poured over his head, so that all the bathers jumped up and rolled themselves in it, and by slipping in it created great amusement, as did the king himself. For the standards of the time, this was absolute lunatic behavior for a king of a major empire. Mingling with commoners? Absolutely scandalous! Because of this, his detractors often called him Antiochus Epiphanes. For those of you who don't know Greek, his original name in Greek people correct me if I'm wrong about this, Antiochus Epiphanes means something along the lines of Antiochus the god manifested. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus the madman, referring to his erratic behavior. Now, if that was all there was to Antiochus Epiphanes, I wouldn't be making this video. However, he is an Antichrist candidate due to his absolutely diabolical treatment of Jewish people. To set the stage, Judean politics were a shit show. Basically, the former high priest Onias III got assassinated by his brother Menelaus, who took the title from his brother Jason. Hello, Future Taiga here. It's actually very unlikely that Menelaus and Jason were brothers. Josephus actually gets this wrong. And I use Josephus as a source, so you'll see me repeat this one mistake over and over again, just giving you guys the heads up. My sources do not really like either of them. Second Maccabees describes Jason as the vile Jason, who is introducing, quote, such an extreme Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who is ungodly and no true high priest. First Maccabees calls the both of them renegade Jews, who, quote, built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the customs of the nations, and made foreskins for themselves, and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the nations and sold themselves to do evil. How they made foreskins for themselves is beyond me. Meanwhile, their Egyptian rulers under Ptolemy Philometor had no idea what the fuck they were doing. Seeing that the chance was right, Antiochus Epiphanes invaded and decisively won against the Egyptians, taking Judea with him, although he couldn't take Alexandria in time because Egypt was allies with Rome, and Antiochus understandably did not want to fuck with the literal largest military power that was currently around. After 2 years of Seleucid occupation, Antiochus pulled up to Jerusalem and was essentially like, hey, if it isn't some members of my favorite ethnic group in Asia.
Oh hey man, what's up?
Nothing much. Say, why aren't you guys manning the usual defenses of the city?
Oh, it's Shabbat. We are legally required not to work on it.
Wait, really?
Yeah man, we get stoned if we work on Shabbat.
Getting stoned? That doesn't really sound too bad.
No, we literally get half buried and have stones thrown at us until we die.
Oh, so you can't defend the city.
I don't want to take my chances. Why? You're acting suspicious.
Can me and my escorts please enter the city? I can 100% guarantee you that we will totally respect you guys and not sack the city, pillage your temple, and burn down houses.
Why do you need 1,000 suspiciously well-armed men to escort you?
Occupational hazard. Statistically speaking, I'm actually very likely to be assassinated by an angry family member or a power-hungry advisor or politician.
Seems legit to me. Welcome to Jerusalem.
Thanks, man. You're the best.
Man, he's such a...
Antiochus sacked the city of Jerusalem, stealing everything of value, looting the Second Temple, and burning down places left and right. Afterwards, he and his Egyptian allies installed policies meant to suppress Judaism. Flavius Josephus described these laws in Antiquities of the Jews. Quote, he also commanded them not to circumcise their sons, and threatened to punish any that should be found to have transgressed his injunction. He also appointed overseers, who should compel them to do what he commanded. And indeed many Jews there were who complied with the king's commands, either voluntarily or out of fear of the penalty that was denounced. But the best men and those of the noblest souls did not regard him, but did pay a greater respect to the customs of their country than concern as to the punishment which he threatened to the disobedient, on which account they every day underwent great miseries and bitter torments, for they were whipped with rods, and their bodies were torn to pieces, and were crucified while they were still alive, and breathed. They also strangled those women and their sons whom they had circumcised, as the king had appointed, hanging their sons about their necks as if they were upon the crosses, and if there were any sacred book of the law found, it was destroyed, and those with whom they were found miserably perished also." Unquote. But one of the most diabolical laws was the policy on sacrifice. In the Second Temple and other religious places around Judea, idols and altars to the Greek gods were set up, and Antiochus required them to sacrifice swine to these gods every day under the fear of death. To the Jews at the time, nothing could have been worse. In the words of the author of 1 Maccabees, they were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. Meanwhile, in Modane, there was this Jewish priest named Mattathias, who had served in Jerusalem. His 5 sons are worth noting due to the role they play in this story, his sons being John Gadi, Simon Thassi, Judas Maccabeus, Eleazar of Varan, and Jonathan Aphus. Mattathias was a very devout Jew who took the traditional law very seriously and was disgusted by the recent reforms. One day, an officer of Antiochus came to Mattathias and basically said, "Look, if you sacrifice a pig to Zeus or something, we'll give you a fuck ton of money." Mattathias said, "Hell no, I am not doing that." So the officer got some other Jew nearby to do it. When Mattathias saw him do it, he deadass killed the guy who did it and the officer, who asked before he shouted verbatim, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." After that, Mattathias, his family, and his supporters hid in the wilderness. Eventually, they kick-started what history would later know as the Maccabean Revolt. After about a year, Mattathias would die of natural causes, leaving the rebellion to his son Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus comes from the Hebrew word maccabee, which means hammer, or sledgehammer. The rebels did a surprisingly good job at fighting against the Seleucids, beating out Samaritan forces under the control of Apollonius and the forces of a Seleucid general named Saron. As 1 Maccabees reports, when King Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered, and he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. He opened his coffers and gave a year's pay to his forces and ordered them to be ready for any need. Then he saw that the money in the treasury was exhausted, and that the tribute payments from the country were small because of the dissension and disaster that he had caused in the land by abolishing the laws that had existed from the earliest days. He feared that he might not have such funds as he had before for his expenses and for the gifts that he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. He was greatly perplexed in mind. Then he determined to go to Persia and collect the tribute payments from those regions and raise a large fund. While he was busy taxing various Persians, he put some guy named Lysias in charge. He also failed to defeat the Maccabees, who decided to take some time off of squad-wiping Seleucid generals in order to renovate Jerusalem and the Second Temple, choosing new devoted priests and getting rid of the pagan stuff. The residents received this new change happily, and this process of rededication is commemorated in the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, which is well known for being the most widely known Jewish holiday amongst American non-Jews, despite actually being a very minor holiday. There are these 5 major holidays, and Hanukkah is not one of them. To make a long story short, the Jews continued to beat the shit out of neighboring armies. Meanwhile, Antiochus Epiphanes was besieging the city of Elymais. After losing and leaving for Babylon to lick his wounds, he received news that the handling of the Maccabean Revolt was going poorly. Too many things had compounded together, and his health declined radically for the worse. Before he died, however, he entrusted the kingdom to his friend Philip, and he died a few days later. According to Josephus, Antiochus had these punishments against him because of, quote, the miseries he had brought upon the Jewish nation, while he plundered their temple and condemned their God. Meanwhile, Polybius writes that, quote, Antiochus died because he had a purpose to plunder the temple of Diana in Persia, unquote. I'll leave it up to you to decide which one it was. Following Antiochus Epiphanes' death, his son picked up where his father left off. However, the Maccabean Revolt would last for 2 decades more, while the Seleucid Empire began to collapse due to pressure from the Romans and the Parthians. Ultimately, Judea would regain independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, which lasted until Pompey decided to do a little bit of trolling. So, what makes Antiochus IV Epiphanes a contender for the Antichrist title? It would be pretty hard for a person who died before Christ was born to be an Antichrist. To explain why, we must turn towards the Book of Daniel from the Bible. The Book of Daniel is about a former Judahite royal named Daniel, who was carted off to Babylon to serve King Nebuchadnezzar II during the Babylonian exile, a period of time where a sizable portion of the Judahite population was exiled to areas around the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But we are going to ignore the main plot. Instead, throughout the book, Daniel has prophetic dreams that are supposed to reveal stuff about the future. There are several important visions, but the most important ones for this video are in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Daniel 11, though the other ones basically give more context to these. In Daniel 7, Daniel describes a dream in which he saw 4 beasts rise out of the sea, those being a lion with eagle wings, a bear with ribs between its teeth, a 4-headed winged leopard, and a dreadful beast with 10 horns. The smallest horn spoke arrogantly. It's explained that these 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms, with the 4th one having dominion until its judgment. In Daniel 8, Daniel sees a mighty ram with 2 horns getting killed by a goat with 1 great horn, which breaks and is replaced by 4 horns, out of one of which comes a little horn. Gabriel explains that the mighty ram represents the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and the goat represents Alexander the Great's empire with the great horn as the first king. The 4 smaller horns represent the 4 kingdoms that sprung up after the Macedonian Empire collapsed, those being Ptolemaic Egypt, Antigonan Macedon, Attalid Pergamum, and the Seleucid Empire, with the little horn corresponding to the little horn in the last prophecy. Finally, in Daniel 11, as part of a bigger prophecy, it was foretold that a king would rise up among the Greeks and rule with great dominion, but that his kingdom would be divided in 4. Then the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south would wage war against each other and establish marriage alliances. However, a vile person would eventually become the king of the north, exploit the land, and, quote, place an abomination that maketh it desolate, unquote. But eventually the king of the north would face trouble and would die with no one to help him. Traditionally, in the Christian view of things, the prophecies present in the book of Daniel are foreshadowing the Antichrist. After all, the whole placing an abomination that maketh desolate thing sounds like a thing that the Antichrist would do. However, there is an alternative explanation. One commonly accepted idea nowadays is that the book of Daniel was written sometime at the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt, but before the death of Antiochus IV. If we take this idea into account, a different interpretation of these prophecies previously mentioned would be as a diss on Antiochus Epiphanes. In Daniel 7, the lion represents Babylon, the bear represents the Medes, the leopard represents the Persians, and the beast represents Greece. Its 10 horns represent the Greek rulers of Judea, with the arrogant little horn being the 10th one, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. In Daniel 8, most of the prophecy is already explained in the book by the angel Gabriel, with the little horn again corresponding to Antiochus. Finally, the last vision is a pretty straightforward, albeit cryptic account of history. There was a king who rose up amongst the Greeks and ruled with great dominion. That was Alexander the Great. His kingdom was divided in 4, and then there was a kingdom of the north that fought against a kingdom of the south, the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. They fought wars with each other and frequently made marriage alliances. However, the vile person that eventually placed an abomination that maketh desolate, that the book of Daniel describes, was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It's here now that I bring up the ultimate tool of YouTubers everywhere: tier lists. How this works is we're going to take the 7 deadly sins, have a 1 to 10 scale on each, with 1 being completely innocent and 10 being a literal demon, grade them based on that, take the total percentage and place that in whichever tier that qualifies in. 90% is S tier, 80% is A tier, 70% is B tier, 60% is C tier, 50% is D tier, and everywhere below is F. Starting with the lust category, Antiochus gets an 8 out of 10 for fucking his sister and producing children. As someone who has a sibling, incest is fucking disgusting, and the only reason that people get off to incest porn is that they're an only child who has never had a brother or a sister. Yeah, hot take of the century, I know, but with gluttony, he gets a 5. He's pretty wasteful and consumes a lot, as seen in Polybius' descriptions of him, but honestly, that's pretty normal for kings from his time and location. I can't fault someone from being a little eccentric. Greed, though, he's getting a 7. You kind of have to have that level of greed in order to invade, loot, and steal from people. With sloth, he's getting a 2. He doesn't strike me as the type of guy to sit on his ass doing nothing, although he doesn't personally deal with the Maccabean Revolt himself, so I don't know. In the wrath category, I'll give him a 6. He does pursue harmful policies out of his anger at times, but I didn't put it any higher because many of his discriminatory policies were not done out of anger, but of pure diabolical behavior. In terms of envy, he's getting a 6. There's a good chance that he may or may not have murdered his nephew for the throne, but since I don't know, but since it's still likely, it just averages out to a 6. Finally, for the pride category, he's getting a 9 out of 10. All of his more bigoted policies could be chalked up to, well, my customs are better than yours. Plus, his title literally means the God manifested. You need a little bit of an ego to title yourself that. With all that said, I'm going to subtract 1 from the pride, gluttony, greed, and wrath categories each. I didn't mention this earlier, but the thing about Antiochus Epiphanes is that our best sources for his deeds come from the books of Maccabees and Josephus, extremely orthodox Jews who represent the Maccabees, the side that won the war against the Seleucids. There is a very real bias present in both works, especially Maccabees, so I have to account for that. It's the main reason why I added the disclaimer that you shouldn't take this video seriously. Sure, it's good to have sources as close to the events as possible, but we still have to assess the sources we use critically. Tallying up the updated scores, Antiochus scores a 39 out of 70, placing him in a very surprising D tier. It may surprise you that the guy an entire book of the Bible spends half its length dissing is only a D tier Antichrist candidate, but consider that we don't really know that much about him besides what his enemies told us, and I'm more willing to rank someone low than high for this tier list, so into low tier he goes. So yeah, that's the video. Thanks for watching, and well, stick around if I ever decide to make a part 2 of this, which I will if this video does well.